after doing the memorial project and doing some more sculpture, I moved into a whole series of two-dimensional work related to the human genome. I had done a sculpture that had the double helix at its core and knew that there was more to process. And it was all about, so at the same time when I started this project, I had taken a genetics test, and shortly after the genetics test, I began to find family through 23andMe, and beginning to learn a bit about where I'm connected. After it took about 8 years for that to unfold. Funny word, because the human genome is like a ball of ramen noodle, one long connected 3-meter by 5 micron wide ribbon, basically. And that's what my paintings were all about. Endless single lines on these massive canvases or these drawings. And after about 8 years, having been on 23andMe, it was becoming clearer and clearer who my family was. And I was having the expertise of a geneticist, Dr. Diana Bianchi from Tufts, looking at the results and figuring out how that, who was who. Ultimately, I found my father and I found my mother. They had only been together basically around the time of my conception. And I met my brothers, who were on my father's side, and my sisters on my mother's side. And it was wrapping up. Like, by finding the answer to this lifelong mystery, I was ready to move on from this oeuvre of work. And I didn't know where I was going to go. But I did remember the power of those moments when I interacted with the women and men in Memorial, and also the experience of having worked with Candy. And I wanted to do art that was somehow bigger than myself. And I wanted to do art that was somehow bigger than myself. I wanted to make a difference through my art. It's really my sweet spot. That's like, I don't believe I'm going to advance the conversation of the history of art like a Donald Judd or an Andy Warhol. Like, that wasn't going to be me. I wasn't going to make that kind of difference, but I could make a difference by how my art relates to the world on a more social, activist kind of level. So it took a while. It probably took about a year for me to figure it out. But at the same time, I had my first experience with somebody in the military and his family, and I saw these qualities in this family that somehow felt different than my life in Miami. There was this, the father was an Eagle Scout, and he had been a soldier all his life. He went to World War II in Korea and Vietnam and served in the Pentagon. And my friend had been a Ranger and Special Forces fellow. And I was learning about this world, and I was also playing with camouflage material in my studio. And because most of my art previously had been centered around women's issues, the two sort of collided. And I was also simultaneously, we were home, it was COVID time, watching way too much television and seeing George Floyd on on television and feeling that there was so much antipathy between Democrats and Republicans and blacks and whites and Jews and I felt that my democracy was more fragile than I ever could have imagined. And I was moved to do something about that. And like all of these things kind of swirled together, and I started painting a portrait of a woman's face with camouflage. And I just knew I was onto something. And I realized that these women are willing to sacrifice, risk their lives to protect our freedom and our democracy and our Constitution, and that they could serve as an example for what it takes for all of us. As they say, freedom isn't free. And for all of us to start the conversation at our core values, at our core American values. And what I've seen is that when these paintings go up in a room, and I have in the room folks from the Pentagon, folks from Southcom, people in the art world, and people who are the parents of some of the women that are in the paintings, and the general public, it's creating a space for a world that I am more familiar with, was more familiar with, that I wanted to kind of return to. And it's working in that way. And the first time I went to photograph some of the women, I brought with a videographer with me. And I realized when I was talking with them, I was hearing our military history told through the voices of women. And again, that's something I hadn't heard before. And then I visited the Pentagon and was given a private tour and saw maybe one or two portraits of women on the walls. And I knew that our women had been volunteering to serve since the Revolutionary War.